I've got 2 minutes after 7, so I'll go ahead and start. If anybody comes in, that's fine. I'll introduce myself, then we'll dim the light so you can see the show, the slideshow. I'm John Adamson. I'm a member of the board of directors of the Shenandoah County Historical Society. And I have to say I find it strangely ironic that this guy who grew up in Arlington, Virginia, would come to Shenandoah County and talk about barns. So I'm not making any apologies. I've seen a lot of barns and I've learned an awful lot in the last couple of years. My interest in barns of Shenandoah County comes from my interest in our local history. And anybody who's even partway aware of local history knows that the settlers who came here, Germanic ethnic backgrounds, and what do you do when you come to the Shenandoah Valley? You farm. And you can't have a muscle-powered farm without a barn. So the barns become hugely important very fast. And in fact, we're going to talk a lot about barns tonight. I'm going to share how they sort of show us our history. And you're going to go away tonight knowing a word that some of you probably already know, and if you don't, you can't leave until you properly tell me what a forebay is. If you don't know that word, you will before the evening's over. So let's get started. Barbara, if you would turn the lights down, please. That's my wife, Barbara Adamson. And at the end, I'm going to talk, there's brochures about the program and a couple of events I wish to mention. By the way, Barbara is the president of the Shenandoah County Historical Society, so I'm being watched. We're going to see a lot of pictures of barns tonight, and I encourage you to shout out or yell questions or anything at all. Come on in. And I'm not going to be at all formal or anything. There's many slides. We're going to go pretty fast through many of them, and mostly I want everybody to enjoy seeing pictures of barns. I think I've been told, "Oh, John, you're a good photographer." No, I'm taking pictures of barns. It's hard to go wrong, So, what happened to get started on barns? As I said, it's through the interest in history. About 2 years ago or so, Sally Veach, a local artist, some of you may know her, sent out a sort of crying email to the world of people she knew, and somehow it got to me, saying, isn't anybody going to do something to save the barns of Shenandoah County? That's what she was interested in. She's an artist, and she was hoping somebody would take up on that. And I had been thinking about barns for a long time. You may know I write an article every quarter for the Shenandoah County Historical Society newsletter about old buildings. And I had been doing this maybe for, I don't know, Janet, is it 10 years or 8 years or some pretty lengthy time. And I'd seen a lot of good old buildings in Shenandoah County and learned how to explore them and look for signs of their age and use and so forth. And I had honestly kind of missed the barns in a way. And I had had a growing realization that they were really important and they deserved attention. And so Sally's email got me going. And by academic training, I am a statistician. And my first thought was, well, I can't save every barn, but I can sure take pictures and build a database about what we have, what's in our county right now. And that's what I'm doing right now is going around looking at every barn I can, taking pictures, and I have a database with 165 Shenandoah County barns in it. I would like to generate interest and excitement. I want everybody to be as turned on by barns as I am. Eventually, I'll write a book, I hope, but I don't know enough right now to do that. And create preservation resources. Maybe money, but certainly contacts, information, that sort of thing. So the barns are our history. That's what I think. Our county is gorgeous. Everybody who lives here says so, and I agree. One of the most iconic things about our county is the farms, and you can't see a farm without seeing a barn, hopefully. And it makes Shenandoah, they add to the beauty of Shenandoah County. And anybody who owns an old barn knows it doesn't really work anymore for the kind of agriculture that goes on today. Plastic wrapped, rolled up hay, and all kinds of changes have occurred. These barns were built for the muscle-powered farming of their day, and it's done very differently today. So barns are expensive to maintain and repair, and now is a better time to do something about it than 10 years from now. The barns you see in Shenandoah County are, and here I'm talking about what I call historic barns, and that is anything built up until about 1950, and that's not a hard date, but log barns and timber frame barns. The modern pole barns and run-in sheds, I'm not interested in. I'll let the next generation document those. But right now I'm looking at the traditional log and timber frame barns. They were first built by the settlers of German descent, not Germany, because there was no Germany, who came to the area just west of Philadelphia. That dark spot on the map is where they built their core area for these barns. Folks from the upper Rhine River area, eastern Switzerland, they brought a certain architectural style with them, and as they expanded in the early days of settlement, that is the mid and maybe third quarter of the 18th century, they put those barns in this area, right down into the Shenandoah Valley.
A little further north.
And a little, yeah, and then there's some places where they're scattered where you can find them because those German descended people moved west. But you won't find. Recently, I've driven out to Illinois, across Indiana and Ohio, up to New York. You don't see our barns in those places. They're different. And so, because of that, the core area was Pennsylvania, they're called Pennsylvania barns, even though they're in the Shenandoah Valley. So what is that? As I said, from the Rhine River, upper Rhine River, and what I mentioned about the settlement pattern and coming to the Shenandoah Valley. So the key features of this barn are the forebay. It's a bank barn, a bank entrance to the main level, those big doors at the top of the bank. One of the things I had to learn was that's the back of the barn. It's not the front of the barn. The forebay is on the front side, and the forebay protects the animal stalls and the yard below and the doors to the stabling areas. And typically the forebay faces east or south, right, Sharon? Because the wind comes from the west and they want to protect the animal entrance. And it's not very, it's very pragmatic. Gravity, you throw the hay from above down to the animals. How simple can that be? So here we have a diagram of a forebay bank barn. The forebay is this part that sticks out. If you think of your forehead, that's how cantilevered, yes, but the word is forebay. 2 years ago, I didn't know what that was. All these barn people were saying, look at that forebay. I mean, what are they talking about? So you see holes in the floor to throw hay down to the stabling area where the animals are, and the bank is on the back side with the entrance so the wagon can get in at this level and bring the hay in to be stored. So here's what one looks like in real life. This is a good Shenandoah County forebay bank barn near Maurytown, and classic. If you want to really be cool, you can say it's posted or it's unposted 4-bay bank barn. If you go tell your friends, I saw an unposted 4-bay bank barn, you need, and that means there are no posts, and the 4-bay truly is cantilevered, sticks out in the air. Actually, this barn was built that way. Those posts are a later addition. I know because they're sitting on concrete, and the barn's from about 1835 or so. Even log barns were built as 4-bay bank barns. And so this one, the 4-bay, is way up high. That's probably 14 feet. And here's the bank entrance. And the log barn is made from logs. This barn probably dates from the 18th century. So how do you build a log barn? We're going to talk about log barns, then timber frame barns a little bit, and then we're just going to look at pictures. So here's how you build a log barn. Anybody got Lincoln logs at home? Yeah. So those two squares are called cribs, and you build two cribs. You might leave a little more space between them than I did on my dining room table, but then you build a sort of back to it. That's going to be the 4-bay if it's 2 levels, and then you put a roof on it, and you got a log barn, a 2-crib log barn, simple as can be. And early on, a lot of them were not 4-bay barns, but rather ground barns, just sitting on the ground, and maybe those 2 log cribs had a floor in them, so hay above and animals below. Timber frame barns are built differently, and they have a lot of timbers that create the frame for the barn. Here we see inside of one. And here's an unusual picture, because this is a barn under construction in Shenandoah County in 1938. And these elements that go across the barn, in this case, there are 5 of them. It's a little hard to tell. You have to kind of know what you're looking at, because they sort of blend together. They're called bents, B-E-N-T, bents. And they're frame elements that are held together by mortise and tenon joinery with pegs. Always, always, always. Sharon, have we even seen a barn without pegs? Almost never. So you say, my barn has pegs. They all do. They all do. This barn was built in 1938. I think we have another picture of the same barn being raised, a different angle. If you don't quite understand about barn raising, I hope, well, here's the barn as it is today, same barn, almost. And when you go in a barn, you never know who's going to greet you. This one was about 600 pounds. And I think he was curious, but he might have been hungry, so I didn't go into the stall with him. But here's about barn raising. So that frame element is a bent. You can see the first one is already raised. There's some temporary braces holding it up while the second one gets raised, literally lifted up and pushed up with these pike poles with spikes on the ends, and there's a rope so it won't go too far. And if the bottom of the barn, the first floor, the foundation and the first floor is already in place, they can raise all the bents in one day. Anybody see the movie Witness? You remember Witness? There's a pretty nice barn raising scene in it that's a little Hollywood, but it gets the idea across pretty well. Look, you can see the next bent is assembled. There it is, ready to go. After they get this one up and temporarily braced, there's the third bent. And so it goes. And look how many people are working on it. And there's a guy, they may actually ride the bents up. And if we went back to the other ones, we would see that. But of course, after all that hard work, they have a big party, and the locals have been cooking hams and fried chicken and pies, and I spoke to a 104-year-old Noah Dellinger about that. Was his barn that was being raised, and he let me copy these photographs. He's the one that had them, and he said he was there at that barn raising, And his comment was, people help each other in those days with no thought of money. The neighbors would get together and help each other raise the barn. Now the master barn builder who came and laid out the foundation and worked on it, he was paid, and he worked on it for more than a day. But for the big barn raising day, it was all done. But thank you. The wood you're going to see in our barns varies. Oak seems to be the preferred wood. In fact, from my observation, it lasts better usually. But you see yellow pine, you see chestnut, and maybe some walnut from time to time. But think about any barn before motor vehicles. You're going to get the wood from nearby, and so if you had a good stand of chestnut, you might use it instead of looking for oak. So as we go through it now, we're going to just look at a lot of barns with a few comments from myself. But everybody wants to know, how old is the barn? When was it built? When was it built? And indeed, that's kind of fun, and it's part of history. You know, if you're trying to understand barn evolution and what was built when and where, and is it a pre-Civil War barn or is it post-Civil War, then you want to know when it was built. And you didn't need a permit to build a barn. There's no public record typically. So unless somebody wrote it down, the family members kept a diary or some notes or took a picture, which is pretty rare. You just don't know. But there are ways to tell how old a barn is, and one of them is the barn form and structure. If it's a log barn, it's probably really old. It's almost certainly a pre-Civil War barn. And you can look at the timbers and see if they're hand hewn, if they're sawed with a sash saw, a circular saw. You can ask the barn owner what they know about their barn. Sometimes you learn a lot. Sometimes it's pretty fluffy. Or I bought this in 2007, and the guy I bought it from bought it in 2001, and nobody knows anything. The foundation is a clue. If you have a concrete foundation, your barn was built after 1910, maybe 1915. But somewhere in that period, locally, we transitioned from stone to concrete. Which sometimes you have to look hard because there might be a lot of concrete repairs over an old stone foundation. You can look at public records. From time to time, there's information in a deed. I've seen a couple, but not typically. Property tax, maybe, usually just tells you the value of all the buildings. Private records, letters, books. Barns have dates in them sometimes, what I call found dates, carved in the timbers, painted on the doors, chiseled in the stone. But we're going to see you can't trust that to mean it's the date that the barn was built. It might be, but it might not be.
Our barn has a 1933 license plate nailed in among the siding. We think that's when it was re-sided.
But you could put that 1933 license plate in a barn today, so yeah.
But it's way up and quite rusty.
Yep. You'd have to use judgment, how the joinery works, the roof shape, whether it's symmetrical, the form of the roof sometimes is a clue. There's a lot of clues. I've read a lot of books. I talk to local people who know old buildings, and after a while you kind of get a sense of this. But one thing is for sure, and as a statistician I know this, you're usually wrong. I mean, you're close if you're lucky, or if you see a lot of clues, you'll get close. But if you say 1895 and you find out later it was really 1890, you're pretty happy. That would be a good guess. Okay, hewn timbers, done with an axe to score the timber, and then an adze to chop it smooth, or square it off, not smooth. You can see the axe marks in this one. They're usually the timbers in a hewn timbers in a barn are not finely finished. In other words, they didn't try to get it too smooth. They didn't need it to be pretty. By the way, that ladder was built into the bent when they raised it. And in an old barn, you can see the rungs on the ladders are worn, really worn from people going up. There's some guys, I hope they have steel-toed boots. But they're doing the final step in hewing that surface of those logs. The next technology in timber framing for creating the timbers is a sash saw. Some people call it an up and down saw. And you can see that the saw marks from this one are very straight and parallel. In fact, very evenly spaced. It's typically a water-powered saw. It looks like a window sash, but instead of a pane of glass, it has a saw blade. And it goes up and down, and the carriage moves slowly. It goes about, if you go on to YouTube, and you can see some still in operation today, it goes about as fast as if a giant was sawing by hand. It's not fast. There's a picture of that I took out of Eric Sloan's book. You see the eccentric, the water turns the wheel, and this one has five blades in it, so you can cut more boards at once. But that's how they work. So usually along a stream somewhere. Circular saw marks, just what it sounds like. You can see the curved marks from the saw in this barn. By the way, this one's got no Roman numerals in it. That's kind of unusual in barns. Occasionally you see this part of the bent matched up that way, but not typical. More common in a residential timber frame building. So here's this is a circular saw, and I hope it doesn't start while he's sharpening it. But sometime after the Civil War, steam-powered circular saws began to be used more and more. And you could drive a circular saw off of that steam. It looks like a tractor, but it may not even be a tractor. It may not have any motive power. It may be pulled by horses, but it's a steam engine and a long leather belt and a circular saw. So they were kind of portable. And I don't think we see them in Shenandoah County until typically after the Civil War. Anybody have Lakes Atlas at home, the 1885 Atlas? Good for you. You get a gold star. This is the southern district in the county. There's Newmarket. Here's, let's see, this is Moore's Store, and a Forestville is up here. But those blue dots are, I got out my magnifying glass. Those blue dots are where sawmills were in 1885. There's a dozen of them just in the bottom sixth of the county. And if you go through the whole atlas and don't even look at the towns, just the rural areas, I found 51 sawmills in Shenandoah County in 1885. So it gives you a sense of how much was going on. Of course, they weren't all for barns. Almost any building was built out of wood in those days, at that time. Found dates: 1913, May 24th, 1894, JPR 1913. In both of these cases, I believe them to be the date the barn was built, but like I said, you don't really know. And here's 1893, and then here's Cool, May 13th, 1901. Oh, April 9th, 1909. Well, you know they aren't both the date the barn was built. So, and by the way, I think that Cool is a weather report. So, like I said, you don't know. When you see a date, you don't really know what it means. And this is in the same barn, 1889, 1906. So go figure. We just saw that. I'm talking, Sharon Weatherholtz has been helping tremendously in the barn surveys, and she lines up the barns and goes with me, and I hold the dumb end of the tape, and we stomp around in the barns and measure what length and width and look for whatever we can find. In this case, whoops, let me go back. This is on Swover Creek Road, and this is a little hard to read, but when you're there, it's 1877. Now, when I see a date carved in a stone in the foundation, I'm going to say that's a construction date. They're not going to do that because they came along So I think that barn was built in 1877. Now I'm going to just start looking at barns. This barn near just west of Strasburg is a 2-crib log, 4-bay bank barn, classic. And the asymmetrical shape of its roof line is a real clue. You see this, and even if it's covered in metal siding, you're looking at a very old barn. And this one had a very logical date of 1791 based on the settlement of this property. But again, I don't know that that's really right. Here's another log barn. I guessed it at 1790. When you went inside this one, it's covered in metal. But if you, as I mentioned, that roof shape is there. This side is longer than this side. And you go inside that barn, boom, you find the president of the Historical Society. But there's that log crib. And those are oak logs, I'm quite sure. And another log barn near Mount Olive. And again, you look at the outside, it's hard to say, but when you go inside, there it is. There's that log crib right there. I was surprised. This one actually had the roof raised. This barn had been changed many times, but still serving, and probably from 1800 or maybe even earlier. This barn is my personal log barn favorite in Shenandoah County because that date, 1772, is pretty hard. In other words, pretty well documented. Jonathan Clark, a surveyor, was recording the structures on farms to settle a land dispute in 1786. He went around and looked at a bunch of properties, and he wrote what was there. And in this case, he came to the Nicholas Salm farm, and he said, "A log house 14 years old and a barn of the same age." So here's a pre-Revolutionary War log barn in Shenandoah County. And I think if you went to Switzerland and looked for log barns, you'd see something that looks a lot like this. Which leads me to a thought. The barns of Shenandoah County descend from these European roots that I've mentioned. But if you went to Europe today, you won't see the 4-bay bank barn. That's American. That's an evolution in America of this form. By the way, this is a 4-bay bank barn, and I don't know if this picture quite shows it, but the 4-bay is back there. It extends behind the log crib some. There's inside the same barn. You can see the crib clearly and distinctly. The joinery of the corner notching is called V-notch. The top of the log is a V that fits into a recessed V on the bottom of the log on top of it. And in Shenandoah County, that's all you find. That's the way they built log structures. And there's the Nicholas Salm. 14 years built. One log barn, 48 by 24, about the same age, straw cover. That's the roof. It had a straw roof. Across the road from it, another log barn from a similar period. Log barns in Shenandoah County. I've been talking to some authors who've written barn books about Pennsylvania. They both thought we didn't have any logs from before the any barns from before the Civil War. Here's another one near Maurytown. This is a ground barn. In other words, no bank. It's just one story inside, and when you go inside, you're walking on the earth. But it's another very old barn. Fort Valley, same thing. A characteristic of our log barns is this big overhang. In a way, it sort of pre-shadows the 4-bay, so it gives some shelter to the entrance of the barn. Inside that barn, you see the 2 log cribs. This is not the same barn. It's another one nearby, so somebody was building barns the same way in Fort Valley. And inside that barn, now they cut this door into the crib, and they didn't really brace it, so this log has failed from the weight of that's a floor, so hay mow above, animal stall below. That sort of predates the four-bay bank barn. Here's a barn in the southern part of the county near Forestville. This one is interesting. You go inside and there's a log crib on one side, and you turn, if it's staying in the same place, and turn and take a picture the other way, it's got timber framing, so it's sort of transitional. It's got both framing types in it. Another four-bay bank barn with no posts, pre-Civil War, all the tool marks surely make it look a pre-Civil War barn. And here, inside that barn, this is oak. When you get that gray, that's oak. You can see the hewn timbers. This is a lap joint. So this timber hooks with the next one on top of a post, and they lap like this. And there's one right there, another one right there. Under the barn, there are usually two long beams that go the length of the barn, and they're not necessarily one piece. They're called summer beams. And here you can see there are two pieces at least. And they hold the floor joists, which hold the floor of the level above.
Just squared off on two sides.
But we often, the joist only is hewn on two sides. It's they just got the bark off the other sides. Sharon and I saw a barn the other day with yellow pine summer beams in it, and they were 54 feet long, one piece. Imagine a pine tree big enough to make a timber like that. You won't find those around much anymore.
Question?
Yeah.
So within the timber frame barns, each timber framer kind of has their own style for building a barn and for the joinery. Can you tell when you look at these barns whether they've been made or designed and made by the same person, the same?
I'm not good enough to do that. I believe that's possible. And I need to learn some more. If I would go back to the 165 barns I've seen, I might look more carefully at the form of the bents.
The joinery itself.
But the master barn builder had a template, and 4 bents for a 48-foot long barn, 5 bents for a 60-foot long barn. I mean, you see repeated patterns, but
But you could have the same size barn, same dimensions, and two timber framers would build it differently.
there would be differences, yeah. And in fact, no two barns are exactly the same, but you might find strong similarities. How they're vented, the way they breathe, sometimes you see repeated patterns. Here's one where somebody had removed the brace. So here's a mortise. That's the hole, that is the slot. And there's the peg. And where's the piece that went in it? I don't know. It's gone. It was removed. But here's another barn where we see the tenon, the piece that goes in. This one, the peg must have worked loose, and the brace, this diagonal piece, has come out, but I didn't even notice this till I got home and looked at pictures. I said, oh, look, you can see the mortise and tenon joint clearly in this case. A different way of supporting with a little shoulder, but this timber is mortised. It has a tenon, and there's the peg, and there's another round peg. Here's a barn with a lot of different eras to it. The core old barn is this part here, but here's an addition, here's an addition. So you have to be a bit of a detective to kind of figure out, well, what's the original barn? When was it built? Don't get confused by the additions, the added sheds, etc. And that same barn, this picture, here's the notching. This is a floor joist. And I'm sure this barn replaced an even older barn that was torn down, and they used the logs from the log barn to make the floor joists of this barn. And reused material, we're in Shenandoah County, man, that's what you find. The farmers are nothing if they're not pragmatic, and if it's good, they'll use it again, and it can make the detective work kind of hard to figure out sometimes. This one looks like every other barn. By the way, everybody, what's this part called? Say it. Okay, good. But it has a concrete foundation, and it's a big one. This one's 80 feet long, full of hay. And there's its foundation. So you just know it's after 1950. Here's a little barn. It has a stockyard neatly surrounding the 4-bay side. Of course, the bank entrance on the other side. But this one was fun because there it is 100 years ago, same barn. Now it's painted white. It's a small barn. It's only 40 feet long. It was a sheep barn, the owner told me. And how did she know it was sheep? Because they're sheep. Yeah. And her relatives built that barn. Neatly done, but there's it's a 4-bay bank barn sized for smaller animals. On the same farm, another barn. This one has a date of, this is well documented family history, 1919, and there it is 100 years ago, more or less, with the family out in front. Same barn. The only thing different is the silos changed. There's the modern silo, there's the an older silo. When we go underneath that barn, it's as square and straight and neat and strong as the day it was built. It's a great, great barn. A clue to a barn nerd is that the floor joists are milled, that is sawn on all 4 sides. That's a clue that it's more modern or later than other barns. This barn is built right next to the site of where a barn was burned during the Civil War. The barn neck was right there, and right after the war they rebuilt and built this barn. And there it is inside. And you can see one of the bents. Actually, you can see 2 of the bents because a bent holds the gable end wall, and then the second bent. Town of Woodstock owns this barn now. Big barn. Hope they spend some money on it and make it into an event space. Could be done. It's a big barn. The county farm near Barrytown at the site of the almshouse. Great big barn, 1950. Built. That date's pretty good because the one there prior burned, and we know when this one was built. But it's still a timber frame barn with summer beams like we expect to find. Same use, and it was used sort of the same way as barns right up to its date. You just don't know what you're going to find inside a barn, bankside. You go inside, and there was a time when the animals were, and this farm still has the gear for the draft horses and a tractor some kind of steering wheel. You never know what you're going to see. One being used for weddings near Mount Jackson. In the corner of most of these barns is a granary. In this case, the corner granary was converted into a little stage for the bands. And I think when I surveyed this barn, he told me he had 17 weddings lined up for fall of 2018. Yeah, he put it in a pretty floor too. But it's one way that barn gets preserved when it's repurposed. And we're just looking at more timber frame barns. Dennis, you recognize this one, Dennis? This is a really old barn. It's covered in metal, so when you first see it, you don't really know how old it is. But you look at the foundation, and it's a good, well-made. The oldest stone foundations seem to be the neatest and prettiest. That's a rule of thumb that's not necessarily always true. But one thing in this barn that I noticed, and I'm looking straight down, the floorboards are attached with big wooden pegs. That's a pretty good clue that it's an old barn. That usually isn't the case. Often they're just laying there. They're so tight together and so heavily used that they're not moving, and they're usually thick because they had to support wagons. But if they're attached, they're often big spikes, big nails, or square nails if it's 1870, and more modern nails if it's after 1880. But when you see wooden pegs, you can guess that's a pre-Civil War barn. Another one covered in metal. This one's being hard used still today for agriculture. Another, just all over Shenandoah County. Here's another pre-Civil War barn. Great old barn. This one had some good graffiti in it. When I say graffiti, the granary had this. June 20th, 1929, threshing 312 bushels of barley. I know you can't read it, but that's what it says. And Sharon and I, as we've been looking, there's the 1929. Some of you might be able to see that. But as we've been I wish I had looked more carefully in every barn for this. It's not in every barn or even many barns, but it's not really rare to find this sort of pencil notation and stroke marks, counting the bushels as they thresh the grain. It gives you a clue: barley in June, wheat in August and September, at least some kinds of wheat. The scale, 312 bushels. 300 turns out to be kind of common. One I saw was 800 bushels of wheat. That's a big crop for Shenandoah County. So there's information in the barns. The only brick barn, well, there's another one that's been converted into a residence in Shenandoah County, and this is a 4-bay bank barn. You can see the 4-bay, gorgeous stone foundation, wonderful barn. But timber framed inside, although the walls are brick, and those slits that you see on the outside widen as they come into the barn, and that lets more light and air in. It's not for shooting rifles out of. It's light and ventilation. Here's a classic little 48-foot 4-bay, 4-bent 4-bay bank barn, and I was inspired. I submitted this picture to the Northern Virginia Daily, and they published it in their calendar. Fort Valley, a red barn. Gorgeous, just gorgeous.
What road's it on? Beach?
It's not far off of Fort Valley Road, but it's
How far down the valley?
just south of the fire hall, and you go east a little bit. Wayne Cullors. Anybody know Wayne Cullors? It's his barn.
Is that the one that's at the bend?
Oh. There's lots of barns in Shenandoah County. This is the smallest 4-bay bank barn I think I saw. It's tiny, and inside it, there's a cool farm wagon. This barn had just gotten new skin, metal skin on it, and some people would say, "Well, that's not very traditional." Yeah, but that preserves the barn. That really works, and you can see it when you look at a lot of barns. This barn is huge inside, and you can get a sense of how tall it is. There's the vent on the gable end. Another barn, and when you see this kind of feeding structure, it looks like it's in use. You can guess it may be, and guess what? It is. The sheep thought we were going to feed them, and they came out and said, "All right, we're ready." And they were real quiet. They didn't say a word until we started leaving, and that we hadn't fed them. And then they let loose. They said, "Hey, come back." Over in Fort Valley, the Boyer barn, he ran a sash saw mill, and every board in that barn is sash sawn, and it has critter inside too. Anybody know what kind of owl that is? Are you good at with your? No, well, yeah, it's a barn owl. It's an owl in a barn. It's actually a screech owl.
Is it?
Yeah.
It's kind of big.
Yeah, but you look him up. That's what it is.
Yeah, it was much smaller.
You had a saw-whet owl, a little tiny guy. But this one's about this big. Anyway, fun to see. Another Fort Valley barn, classic pretty barn. Unposted. What kind of barn is it? Unposted 4-bay bank barn? Yeah, okay. I know you're all going to say that. This one's had it's had a shed added to it. This is called a straw shed. Of course, the basic barn is here. An unposted 4-bay bank barn. 1898, the owner's great-grandfather built it. The barn's in real difficult condition. It's probably going to come down real soon. I went inside, and it's wonderful light and a little creaky and scary on a windy day, but it's in Fort Valley also. So you might. Here's another one off a back road, 4-bay bank barn, nicely maintained. It's got a metal skin. Another pre-Civil War barn, 4-bay bank barn. A shed added on the 4-bay side is very common. This barn, you walk up to this one, and you don't know what you're going to see, because here's the basic barn, and you can see it had a 4-bay, but the 4-bay looks like some kind of shed was added to it, and then another shed, and maybe something on the front. So what's going to be? There's a stone foundation. What are you going to find when you go inside? Well, you're going to find all kinds of things, but we decided this is the one that had the 1889 and 1906 date on it. And there on the wall was this graffiti. July 28, 1903, Francis, Dorothy, and Geraldine, they must have weighed themselves on a scale that there is in the barn, and maybe they were, how old is a girl that weighs 100 pounds? She's 12 or 13 maybe, who knows? And two younger boys, and so they're captured on having fun in the barn on July 28, 1903. Concrete foundation, gambrel roof, that is, changes the angle changes, it allows a little more hay to be stored. That's typically a sign of a modern barn, not necessarily, but typically. Here's a ground barn in poor condition. Here's a barn at Fisher's Hill. That part is the original part. All of this was added post-Civil War, and the silo. But that barn is a witness to the battle at Fisher's Hill in September of 1864. Also in Fisher's Hill. And when you see these old slit ventilations, that's a pretty good clue that it's a very old barn. Friends of mine have this barn in Deer Rapids, concrete foundation, 1920, and when that news, sometimes there's living memory of who built it and when. The only barn in all the surveying I've done that did not have a metal roof, that's a shingle roof. Just the owner wanted a shingle roof. Unposted 4-bay bank barn. On Sandy Hook, here's yours truly's barn with Barbara's car parked under an added shed and a kind of ratty old roof on it. And so Barbara and I decided, well, we got to fix the roof, and we did. So we just put a new roof on it. And when the roofers were working on it, they found a board dated August 1st, 1918. And I'm pretty sure that's the year the barn was built. It has a concrete foundation. Another Sandy Hook barn, another one. This is my neighbor across the road. Big, big barn. She told me, I'm going to paint that barn. It hadn't been painted for 20 years. And by gosh, she did. And that's a lot of paint. That's a very big barn. That's a 6-bent barn with a big added shed. And there were outbuildings painted as well. So we'll kind of come to the end. 165 barns looked at. We've found 14 log barns, 151 timber frame barns in the survey, 126 4-bay bank barns. 76% of all the barns surveyed in this survey are 4-bay bank barns. And you can see average length and width and age based on my guesses, with help from Sharon. So I'll think of a date, and then I'll ask Sharon, okay, Sharon, when do you think this barn was built? If she says the same thing I'm thinking of, then we know it's right. Yeah. And look at 65 of the barns are in agricultural use. In other words, 58% are not being used for agriculture anymore. And I would say I'm pretty generous with that definition. If it's storing hay actively, not hay that was put in there 20 years ago and hadn't been touched, and even equipment, a couple animals, anything that's active agriculture, I call it. So that's kind of a clue that our barns are seriously threatened, because they're really not being used for what they were built for in large part. And again, condition, I make a guess. If a barn's in real good shape, I give it a 1. If it's kind of dangerous to go in, I give it a 4, and then a couple of grades in between. And I actually think because of the way we've been identifying barns, we're kind of seeing the better barns in Shenandoah County. There probably are more in bad shape that we're not hearing about. So I don't know how representative that is. and you can see end of an era. Well, look what's in the background at this place. A subdivision. We don't get a lot of that in Shenandoah County, but this barn will never be used again for agriculture. And so I'm just going to let you look at a few before they're gone.
What would you say the prevalence of painted barns are? Many of our barns are not painted.
Yeah. Waste of money? They
They're
didn't.
oak barns and siding.
Maybe 60% are colored, painted. Of course, metal has color often, and it's not paint.
But the exposed wood.
The wooden barns.
Most of the barns, if they're very old, that it's not the original siding. It's been replaced. But on this barn, it probably is the original siding. I don't know. That barn might have been painted 80 years ago. Yeah, you would think you'd see some evidence of it. That's a barn I wouldn't walk in.
Yeah.
Stone foundations collapsed.
That foundation failure is right under the bank entrance, and that's a common problem, believe it or not. That's one place they fail. For some reason, water damage seems to occur at that spot. That barn's probably gone. That's the barn at Seven Bends State Park. I think it was torn down very recently. All Shenandoah County. So, couple things to announce. On March 31st, it's a Sunday afternoon at Swover Creek Farm Brewery, we're having a barn event. Come on out, have some pizza, play some trivia, historic, sort of history trivia with a barn question or two thrown in there. If you paid attention tonight, you might have gotten the answer to a question. We'll sell some T-shirts, yay. And we might have, we're going to encourage people to tell stories about barns. And I'll have a big loop. I won't do this program, but I'll have a loop of barn pictures going during the day. And there's probably some good beer if you're a beer drinker. So March 31st, Sunday, there'll be some announcements and so forth in local media. Another thing, I've been getting some help. I mentioned Sharon Weatherholt's helping me do the surveys. And but one thing I would really, if somebody's inclined to do library kind of research, if somebody likes doing that, I would love it if somebody could find old newspapers. Go to the old copies of the Shenandoah Herald or what, and see any story about barns. A barn that burned, not Civil War necessarily, a barn being built, anything like that, an advertisement for a barn, wherever you might dig to see any documented references to these icons of our county history. I think we need to celebrate them, and we need to know more about them than I do. So if anybody would like to do that, give me a call. I've got a brochure here tonight that has my contact information. Barbara's got some if anybody wants one. And but maybe most importantly, if you own a barn or you have friends or neighbors or relatives that own a barn that hasn't been surveyed, let me know. I will contact the barn owner. They always say yes, and we'll go measure it and photograph it and put it in our database. And with that, I will take. Anybody have any closing questions or comments or thoughts?
Question, John.
Yeah.
How likely is it, based on your discussions with these owners, how likely would it be for them to sell these barns so they could be disassembled, moved, and reassembled? In terms of preserving them?
It's unlikely, but it happens. And in fact, that barn right there, I went to see it because it was advertised in the Valley Trader. $20,000. Come get the parts, and I called the number that was there, and I said, "Can I come see the barn?" He said, "Sure, come on." And he told me he had a buyer for it. I haven't gone back. It's a great barn. I'm kind of sad to think it's gone. But he said he had a buyer for it, one buyer for the floorboards, which were good thick oak, and another for the framing. East of Maurytown, close to the river. Yeah, I've seen their show. They take barns down, and so they're valuable. I mean, the wood. If the barn's in good condition, the wood has value. It's not an easy job if you saw the show to take a barn down, but.
Is that the same guy?
I'm sorry. What was the last?
Where they did all this work is going to be on their upcoming season.
Okay. Anybody seen the Barnwood Builders? Yeah. It's an interesting show. They do some interesting things.
How do we know which barns are on your list?
Well, I've done 165 barns. My guess is, just based now that I've seen that many, that there are probably 800 or so in the county. So chances are good still that I haven't done it. And I'll know it. You know, I keep a record. Every time I survey a barn, I write down the name and all that. So if somebody gives me a double that I've already done, then but it's nothing to have people come up and say, "Oh, you know that barn on Back Road?" And I just go, "That barn on Back Road." Yeah. So Bill Wine was, when we first started doing this, Bill Wine he's a contractor and who does some really nice historic renovation kind of contract work. And he said he was driving home from on Route 42 from a job site. He said, "I counted 45 barns I could see from my car just driving home." So they're everywhere. They still are, and let's hope that many of them will be saved for a long, long time.
You mentioned that you can go to the website and see.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Barbara. Go to the Shenandoah County Historical Society website. It's in the brochure at chs1795.com on the back of my shirt. And you'll scroll down and you'll see historic barns. Click on that, and there's four different things you can do. One of them is a map, a Google Maps map that shows every barn that I have surveyed. Its exact location, and one photograph of it, and a brief description. Unposted 4-bay bank barn, 40 or 60 by 40, 1890. That sort of information. So they're all there. 165 barns, and another 30 or 40 that are just pictures of barns I have not yet surveyed. So do that, and you'll have fun seeing barns all over our county. Well, I'm done. Yeah, please.
On the 26th, March 26th, which is a Tuesday evening, Historical Society has their regular quarterly meeting at the Heritage Center right here in town on High Street. And Nick Powers, who's the curator at Museum of the Shenandoah Valley, is going to talk about cabinet makers whose last name was Wright, William and Thomas Wright. And they're the ones who, they made corner covers and chest of drawers, and they made cabinets for the clocks.
For the tall clocks, yeah.
All the tall clocks that are so expensive and famous and collectible. And I know I, for one,
Tuesday. Great. Thanks for doing that. Any final questions, thoughts? Thanks for coming tonight. It's always, if you ever want to talk about barns, just call me up.